Have you ever wondered why bad things happen to good people? Well, Job was a man who lost everything, but never lost his faith. This is a series I am creating in the podcast about Job called Faith and Fire. This episode is just it's a precursor. It's kind of the background to Job. It's what's going on beforehand and like at right the beginning. So without further ado, let's get into this. So what's the historical context of Job? Well, first you have to understand it is debated whether or not Job was a real person. I personally believe he was a real person, but it is argued that the book was written in the time of the patriarchs, or the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the author is uncertain. Some say Moses, and the people who believe that Job was a real person say Job wrote the book. The reason people think that it is a poetic literature is because it's written in a poetic form. It's very similar to an ancient wisdom literature style that was fictional and meant to just teach without historical accuracy. So, getting that out of the way, what's the location? It's located in the land of Uz, and Job was described as blameless and upright. Now, this land of Uz is an unknown location, likely east of Israel. So, without spending any more time, let's get into the actual structure of the book. We're going to be really looking into chapters 1 and 2, and then after we look into this, we're going to briefly overview the rest of the book of Job. And next episode, I'll hopefully get into the tests, and then we'll get into the debates with his friends. So, first of all, Satan challenges Job's faith, claiming he only serves God because of blessings. Now let's read this first portion of the book. So starting in verse 1. There's a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys. That's a lot of donkeys, if you ask me. And very many servants. So that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one of his day. And they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them. He would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed a God in their hearts." Thus Job did continually. Starting in verse 6, this is Satan being allowed to test Job. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from waking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. So first of all, God permits Satan to test Job's integrity, and this shows God's control. Because if Satan really wanted to test Job, he could have just done it. But God's in control, so Satan actually had to ask permission from God. And that's one of my favorite parts of this. The fact that God is so in control that the world that Satan has dominion over, Satan still has to ask God for permission. That's just crazy to me. But anyways, Job will eventually lose his possessions, his children, and his health, but he will refuse to curse God. Although he isn't perfect in this. We'll get into that later. But the the gist of it is he tries to claim that God has no right to do this to him, in a sense, and he tries to just he asks to be tried by God because he thinks that it would clear him of this, because he has no reason for punishment. But anyway, that's just the gist of it. So in chapters 3 to 37, it's dialogue. It's a lot of dialogue. It's the debate between Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, to try to explain his suffering, believing it must be punishment. Job defends his innocence, wrestles with despair, and questions God's justice, which is never a good thing. Elihu later adds his own perspective, preparing the way for God's response. Now, Elihu is one of my favorite people in the Bible, and we'll get into why later, but just hold on to that. And chapters 38 to 41 is God's response. God answers Job out of a whirlwind, not explaining why exactly, but showing how powerful and how wise he is. It just how Job has no right to question him because of his unfathomable majesty and wisdom and justiceness. And because of this, Job realizes his limited understanding, and he humbles himself. And in chapter 42, Job repents in his humility, and God restores his fortune and blesses him even more than before. This just goes to show that God gives tests, but afterwards, he cares. And if you go to God, he restores fortunes and blesses them even more than before. Not in material, not necessarily in material goods, but you do get wiser, you get stronger. The phrase "what doesn't kill you makes you stronger" is so true, because it'll make you mentally stronger, it'll make you spiritually stronger, it'll make you wiser, smarter, and it'll help you to deal with loss or grief or tests later on. But anyway, what are the major themes and lessons over the book of Job? The problem of suffering is one of them, and Job shows us that suffering isn't always a punishment for sin. Sometimes it's just a test, and we have to understand that if someone's going through something, they haven't sinned. It's like in Matthew, when the disciples ask Jesus, they're going to the blind man, and the disciples like, who sinned, this man or his parents? And God says, neither of them sinned. This man is blind to show my glory. Sometimes that's what happens. You're tested, or you're used to show God's glory, or sometimes it is a punishment. But it can go both ways. Another thing is, God cares about you, even in suffering. Nehemiah 1:27 says, "Therefore you gave them into the hand of their enemies, who made them suffer. And in the time of their suffering they cried out to you, and you heard from them from heaven. And according to your great mercies you gave them saviors, who saved them from the hand of their enemies." Again, Nehemiah 1:27. Alexa, stop. Another one is God's justice and wisdom are beyond human understanding. Romans 11:33 says, "Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments, and how inscrutable his ways." Now, all these verses are in ESV, so if you're following in KJV, NIV, whatever, they will look different. But this is the ESV version. I use ESV because it's much easier to break down and much easier to understand. Another lesson is our faith and integrity. Job's perseverance demonstrates true faith, trusting God even when the answers are supposedly absent. And next is God's sovereignty. God is in control even when life feels chaotic and it feels like it's just random and uncontrollable. God is always in control. And the universe operates according to divine wisdom, not human reasoning. There are things in this world beyond our human comprehension and things that we may never understand. And that's proof that this was created by a God. And it's controlled by a God. The universe operates according to divine wisdom, not human reasoning. Another one is the limits of human understanding. Job's story reminds us that not every why will be answered in this life, but we have to trust that God has a reason for everything and a just reason for everything. So what is the modern relevance for Job? This took place thousands of years ago. Job was written thousands of years ago. The world was a lot different then. So for listeners today, everybody experiences loss, pain, and confusion. Everybody. Job offers permission to question, lament, and wrestle with God honestly. Now, this isn't necessarily bad. Is it wrong to say, God, why? No, it's not. But it is wrong when you start to call him unjust. There is a line that is very easily crossed. But you are allowed to ask why. You are allowed to be confused. You don't know everything. So you're allowed to be confused. You're allowed to lament, and you're allowed to just wrestle with God in a sense. And faith doesn't mean never doubting. It means clinging to God in the dark. You can doubt and you can cling to God. You can say, I don't see any reason why this is happening. I doubt that this, I doubt. I don't know what is happening or why it is happening. But I'm clinging to God and I'm trusting that He has a reason and He has a plan. So here's some key verses to reflect on throughout the book of Job. I got 3. Job 1:21 says, the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Second one is Job 13:15. Though He slay me, yet will I trust Him. In Job 42:5, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. So let's recap. Job's story raises timeless questions about pain, justice, and faith. The book teaches us to trust God's wisdom even when we don't understand His ways. Now, next time we'll look at Job's first response, his lament, and his loss, and what it teaches us about faithful honesty and suffering. And I encourage you before next episode to read Job 1-3 and read Jobs 1-3 because that's pretty much what we're going to be going over next time, and having a base understanding would be wonderful. And as always, thank you for tuning in, and to God be the glory.